Hello. Alright, today I wanted to talk about the build I've been playing and especially been league starting for the last 5 or 6 leagues in a row, including Phrecia, and that is Tainted Pact Self Poison. And I typically play this as a Slayer, but as we'll talk about in a minute, that is not the only way to do this. So, first off, big question, what is Tainted Pact? Well, it is a coral amulet that has a couple of minor mods on it, but the only one that matters is taking chaos damage over time heals you instead while leeching life. So, any sort of chaos damage over time effect, like poison or desecrated ground or whatever, will act as a heal over time as long as you are leeching life. And note that it does specify life here, so using Ghost Reaver to convert over to ES regen or ES leech, it's not going to count. You have to actually be leeching life. Also means that if you stop leeching because your life fills, then the effect turns off. Or if your leech is instantaneous, the effect does not work. And then the other half of that comes from the golden rule. The simplest way to stack a bunch of poison on yourself is to deal it, but then be very moral and ethical about it, and also deal it to yourself, so that you can do unto yourself as you would do unto others. The fact that you also reflect bleeding is largely irrelevant here, but that is also a thing. And it is also worth noting, by the way, that Golden Rule also gives you +1 Chaos Res per poison on you. So you can only stack 100 poisons on yourself, but you're probably going to be giving yourself a lot of chaos resistance here. So you'll get it for free, but you'll also have a fair bit of it automatically, unless you're deliberately self-cursing or something like that. So what is the real benefit of this? Well, if we go over to POB for a sec, then we can see what this build actually looks like. And if we look over on the numbers here, the DPS numbers are based on a target with 80 chaos resistance, so yourself. And we see that the total damage per poison is 233,000. Single target or single poison DPS is 24,000 and change. And if we go over and we look at the calcs on Viper Strike, we'll see that we have a 100% chance to poison, and we can stack 48.28 stacks of poison based on our attack speed. So we take, 24,000 and change, we multiply it by 48 stacks, and we get somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000,000 poison DPS that we are piling onto ourselves. And what that means is every server tick, which is 1/30th of a second, which is the smallest unit of time that the game can calculate. Every server tick, we are going to be healing ourselves via poison for over 33,000 health. Now, we only have like 3,621 life on the build at the moment. So we are full healing ourselves about 9 times over every single server tick. So what that means is anything that is not a real, honest-to-God one-shot physically can't kill us. Because we will always pop back to full health 9 times over before the next time a damage calculation happens. So, take for example Nightmare of Katarina with her Gatling gun mortar attack, where she fires 2-3 dozen projectiles at machine gun speed. Those are all on separate frames. They might only be a couple of frames apart, but that's more than 0, and that means unless she can kill you with one mortar, it doesn't matter. Your life bar just doesn't even blink. Because in the span of time that you take, let's say, 2,000 damage, you recover 33,000, so it doesn't matter. So, as long as you stack enough hit-based mitigation to not get one-shotted, you pretty much can't die. Now, let's we'll move into some of the synergistic effects here in a sec, but that right there is the main crux of the build. Now, the one kind of big caveat is you do need to always be leeching. Obviously, if your leech falls off and your poison is still on, you die in 1 frame. You've got 1/30th of a second to fix your situation before you explode. So that means we need some form of leech, of a life leech is not removed when unreserved life is filled. So the easiest way to do this, certainly in the context of a league starter, is Slayer, pick up Brutal Fervor in Act 3. There you go. By the time you hit Act 4, you'll hit level 42. Strap on your amulet. You're good to go. Your build is functional. And you haven't even killed Malachi yet. And then, all the other Slayer Leech goodies are just extras on top of that. So, you could, for example, in the context of 3.26, where Champion got a huge buff, you could just be a Champion and steal Brutal Fervor via Forbidden Jewels, but that is going to be dependent on Pinnacle boss drops. So what I would do is actually League start Slayer and then respec to Champion once the Forbidden Jewels are actually available, because this is mandatory. Unless you want to take one of the other avenues. Now, you could be a Scion Ascendant with the Slayer node, which means the build kicks on in Act 6 or 7. When you get your second Ascendancy, assuming you go Slayer for your second Ascendancy, and then you're set. Or you could use Petrified Blood and run around at half-life. That would work too. Or you could use the Offering to the Serpent Gloves that drop from Cortex. Now, herein lies one big caveat, and that is leech duration versus poison duration. Obviously, if your poison has a longer duration than your leech, you've got a problem unless you dedicate some methodology, like a life flask, to curing poison on demand in between fights so your leeches don't run out. And that brings us to a special modifier, and that is leech duration, because that modifier almost does not exist. In fact, it exists in 2 places only in the game. Brutal Fervor and Offering to the Serpent. The top line on Brutal Fervor here, 100% increased maximum recovery per life leech. This increases a default leech effect from a maximum of 5 seconds to a maximum of 10 seconds. Compare this to Offering to the Serpent, which has 50% reduced maximum recovery per life leech. So that knocks your leeches down to only 2.5 seconds maximum duration. And also, if you have a percent of your leech as instant, like via the Leech Mastery, 10% of leech is instant, then that also will decrease your leech time by that same amount. So if you're a Slayer with 10% instant leech, your leeches last a maximum of 9 seconds. Or if you're using Offering to the Serpent and you take the Leech Mastery, then your leeches only last 2.25 seconds. So how you choose to get perma-leech will determine how you're going to be building out your poisons. So, for example, a Slayer with his big beefy 10-second leeches can easily use Viper Strike with a bunch of duration increases, and I have this kind of min-maxed so that my poisons last like 9.75 seconds or something, just a little bit less than the 10-second threshold on the leech. And most of that comes from Awakened Unbound ailments. Conversely, if you only have 5-second leeches because you're an Ascendant, then, Viper Strike with Awakened Unbound ailments is probably not the way to go. But, that being said, you can use any skill you want. You just have to be able to inflict poisons consistently. So, as you can see with our Viper Strike, we take Toxic Strikes and Swift Venoms out here, so that's where we get our 100% poison chance from. Rather than using, chance to poison support or something similar. But you could, again, use your poison source of choice, and likewise does not have to be an attack build. You could use Septic Spells and do Spell Poison if you want. It really does not matter. You can do it however you want. And as long as your poison duration is less than your leech duration, you're golden. Also, I'll mention, we are using vanilla Viper Strike, not Viper Strike of the Mamba. And that is simply because we want our poisons to never fall off while we're in combat. Whereas with Viper Strike of the Mamba, because you can't reapply poison to a poisoned enemy, there will be little gaps in your poison as one falls off, some amount of time passes, however brief, then you hit the enemy again, inflict the next poison, and reflect it back to yourself. So, to avoid those little gaps, which could be long enough to die, especially in a really juiced up T17 map or Uber Pinnacle boss, we're just sticking with vanilla Viper Strike here. Though, if 3.26 introduces some kind of Trarthan version, then we'll see. But as of this recording, we don't have any gem data for 3.26, so who's to say? Now, there is another big synergy with this setup that you don't have to use, but is so huge that I wouldn't not use it. And that is a Glorious Vanity with Zibaqua to give us Divine Flesh. So Divine Flesh says all damage taken bypasses Energy Shield. Who cares? We're not stacking Energy Shield in the first place. +5 to maximum Chaos Res. Okay, that's nice. And, crucially, 50% of elemental damage taken as Chaos damage. And note that it does not say elemental damage from hits. This includes damage over time effects. So half of incoming elemental damage over time effects gets taken as chaos damage, and then as long as we're leeching, that gets converted into healing. So let's take, say, a Shaper Beam that does about 16,000 elemental damage per second divided up between all three damage types. Half of that converts to chaos, so we're taking 8,000 elemental, 8,000 chaos. Let's also assume that we have 80 to all elemental resistances just to make everything fair and square. So that 8,000 elemental damage checks against our elemental resistances and gets mitigated down to 1,600. So we're taking 1,600 elemental damage per second. And then the other 8,000 checks against our 80 chaos res and gets converted into 1,600 healing per second. 1,600 minus 1,600 is 0. The Shaper Beam just kind of tickles our cheeks a little and doesn't actually do any damage. And if this was Uber Shaper with a bunch of clones, all, I don't know, let's say 50 clones, all shooting their beams simultaneously, all converging on us, we wouldn't even get a suntan from all of that. They would all just wash right over us like a nice lukewarm shower, and we would take no damage. In fact, if our elemental resistance were a little bit higher than our chaos resistance, the damage side would be less than the healing side, and the beams would actually heal us a little bit. So, because Shaper is such a bro and knows we're helping out his daughter, he just shoots healing lasers at us to make the fight a little easier. Yeah, what a lad. And that works with every elemental damage over time effect in the entire game. That also renders us functionally immune to all ignites and burning effects. Any kind of miscellaneous cold damage over time effects or vortexes or what have you. The rare lightning damage over time effects that are out there that Doriani's prototype builds are terrified of. None of that matters. It all gets knocked down to 0, and we have blanket immunity to all elemental damage over time effects as long as we're leeching. And since we're a Slayer, we're always leeching, especially since we definitely have a Writhing Jar on the potion bar, which I'll mention. Writhing Jar, not strictly mandatory, but the quality of life from this is so enormous that I wouldn't not use it. And I'll also mention, just as a fun bit here, I've been using Doadre's Elixir on this build in particular. The 50% of your max life as chaos damage on use is actually a chaos damage hit. So you can use it to self-hit if you want, but more importantly, the damage is completely irrelevant, especially since we're using a fourth vow. So this is just free full charges all the time forever. And with some flask nodes to make sure that our charges last longer than the potion takes to refill, this is just infinite charges for free forever. That being said, because we are converting 50% of elemental damage to chaos damage, a fourth vow does have tremendous synergy with the build. Again, not mandatory. You could stick a Doppelganger's Guise on here and accomplish kind of the same thing. Fourth vow requires you to stack some armor, but armor applies to chaos damage taken from hits. This means elemental hits just don't matter. We'll look at our defensive stats in here. Our fire res is only 75, cold res is 81, lightning res is 75, chaos is 80. Nothing super special going on there. And our armor is only 31,000. And we can face tank Uber Exarch all day. We can face tank his meteor phases while face tanking his big ad. It's completely trivial. We basically just hold right mouse button to win. And if we pop back to POB for a second, this build is not even min-maxed by any stretch. This was League Start mode that ended up being League Good Enough mode. It does not even use any cluster jewels or anything like that. This was pretty basic. We are using Viper Strike, as I mentioned. And let's go back and put the actual enemy chaos res back to something reasonable. Also, just to show, this is assuming we are leeching. We do have flasks active because they're always active. We can knock this down to 48, not that it makes a difference. And this is against a Pinnacle boss. Well, we'll say 10% shock. And we'll say 10%, 10 stacks of Withered. But they have been in our presence for 100 seconds because we have taken War of Attrition from Forbidden Jewels. And now you'll see we're doing about 5 million real DPS. And then until you add Slayer culling in, we're doing like 6.25 Shaper DPS. So yeah, this, not winning any land speed records, again, especially against Uber Pinnacle bosses, but it gets through content, and it does it with one button. We don't even use war cries or anything like that. This is one button gaming here. The one other big caveat, though, that I want to discuss on the subject of leech duration versus poison duration. And that is building out hit damage versus dot damage. And that is because in order to create a leech, we need to inflict a hit. So if you are only focusing on damage over time effects, then you're not really boosting the magnitude of your leeches. And under most gameplay circumstances, that doesn't really matter. But having a leech fall off is very bad for us, or having a leech fall off at less than its full duration is bad for us. And if we're dealing with enemies with unusually high mitigation, like say 100% delirious enemies that mitigate 94 or 97% of all damage just automatically, then it is very likely that our hits will not actually be doing enough damage to saturate that full leech duration. And so when building this out, having more than just the basic 1% of damage as leeched as life might be necessary, depending on how you scale your hits versus your dots. Obviously, the solution here is just do more damage. If you hit harder, you leech harder. So just min-max your damage more and problem solved. But, until you're doing that level of damage, this is a thing to consider. And you might want to look at picking up a couple extra leech nodes besides just the basic Vitality Void group right there. You might want to use some of the Katava tattoos that give you generic leech on strength nodes. Or if you're going up here, then you might be looking at things like Taste for Blood or some of the other leech nodes that are around the tree, just to pad that out and make sure you're getting enough damage, even in a high mitigation area, to saturate those leeches. For example, another recurring problem I had on this version of the build, where I'm using an Echo Forge and therefore only doing chaos damage against unusually high chaos resistance enemies, like the scientists in some of the heist areas. Those guys are really tanky and have a lot of chaos resistance, and I would find my leeches running out early, and I'd keel over dead while doing those heists. So that is a thing to concern yourself with when balancing out the leech duration versus poison duration formula. Again, you can do it however you want. Personally, I like the 10-second leech with almost 10-second poison approach, because that means all that healing is still going on after you stop hitting things. Let's say the boss goes into an invincibility phase, and maybe you need to soak some damage while not able to hit back. Then you've still got that almost 10-second buffer going before you have to worry about any kind of damage. And oddly enough, we're only pumping up our leeches to be enough to just exist, because we're already healing ourselves for infinity HP per second, basically. The healing from the leech itself is actually statistically irrelevant. Sure, you're getting, 1,300 or 2,000 a second, whatever. Who cares? Doesn't matter when you're already getting 30,000 per second from the self-poison. But that is about it. That's kind of the whole build right there. You can play any skill you want, as long as you're doing poison. If you want to get a little bit fancy, you could use, Apep Slumber, the shield that makes bleeding do chaos damage. You could self-bleed, though you can't stack bleed, as ridiculously as you can stack poison. So I think that's counterproductive. But, one other fun thing that is available as of Settlers that wasn't available before is Blood-Soaked Blade. So, Blood-Soaked Blade says, tinctures inflict weeping wounds instead of mana burn. Effects that interact with mana burn interact with weeping wounds instead. And weeping wounds causes you to lose 1% of your max life per stack. And tinctures deactivate automatically if you hit 1 life, so you can't kill yourself with Blood-Soaked Blade. Now, we just mentioned we're basically recovering infinity HP per second. At 100 stacks of Blood-Soaked Blade, which takes about 100 seconds to activate, you're only taking 100% of your health per second. And we are recovering 30 times our health every 30th of a second. Or I should say we're recovering 9 or 10 times our health. Yeah, let's say 9 times our health, 30 times a second. So we need over 900 stacks of Blood-Soaked Blade just to maybe be able to see our life bar even flicker a little, in between frames, as it starts to outpace, one, maybe, and then we need to get to thousands of stacks of Blood-Soaked Blade before it can even begin to do, before it can even begin to think about outpacing our healing. So we can basically turn a tincture on and just leave it on forever. As long as we can keep our poisons going, we never have to turn off the tincture. So if you wanted to use the, I forget what it's called. There's a unique tincture that inflicts, oops. Let's see here. Grasping Nightshade. Here we go. Is a unique Spore Bloom tincture. It says 25% chance to blind enemies on hit. Okay, that's cool. 20 to 35% increased effective blind. Okay, also kind of cool. Actually, that's enough blind effect right there that even a little bit of evasion, and you're going to be avoiding a lot of hits. But the more important line says melee weapon hits inflict 2 to 3 withered debuffs for 2 seconds, so 100% chance of withered while this is on. And 20 to 30% chance to inflict a grasping vine on melee weapon hit, which is cool if you want to debuff the enemy's speed, movement speed that is, or if you wanted to use the Inextricable Fate boots to let all damage types inflict poison. Yeah, you can just turn on Grasping Nightshade, leave it on forever, and just have free Withered forever, and free Grasping Vines forever. Or any other random tincture that you want. You know, we can craft a tincture here. What are our options? I think there's a poison one, isn't there? Yeah, Poison Berry says 20% chance to poison with melee weapons, and 60 to 90% increased damage with poison from melee weapons. We could just do that. And then we could put any of these fun effects on here, like 29% increased melee weapon attack speed, you know, or a bunch of crit multi, or whatever. You know, there's, you know, mana on hit. You know, increased melee weapon damage against enemies on low life. Whatever you want. You know, you could craft it, use a unique, whatever. Blood-Soaked Blade makes a tincture completely free. So I will definitely have a Grasping Nightshade on my 3.26 starter. And even with perfect rolls, you can buy one of those for like a Chaos or two. Likewise, a very basic Tainted Pact you can buy for a Chaos. In fact, people usually regard it as a booby prize from the Corrupted Unique div cards. So even with a pretty decent corruption, like you know, +1 max resists, +1 curse, something like that, you could probably get that for not much. You know, handful of chaos, maybe a div. Even with a nice double corruption here, with you know, would not run much. In fact, the whole build I put together for you know, a handful of divs. Tides of Time, Celestial Brace. This is going to be expensive next league because everybody's going to be stacking Fortitude or Fortification. Echo Forge, you can usually buy early league for a couple divs with pretty respectable rolls on it. You know, I re-rolled this one up to be better than perfect as kind of a late league min-maxing fun project. But again, you can use basically any weapon you want or any spell you want as long as you're inflicting poison. So lots of flexibility here. I fully expect, as I mentioned before, I will league start Slayer. And unless Champion gets nerfed into the ground before release, I'll probably swap to Champion once I'm actively farming divs and endgame or mid to late game, and you know, just pick up a Brutal Fervor Forbidden Jewel set if it's not outrageously expensive. compared to just stealing a champion node with Forbidden Jewels, which is, you know what, might be cheap because everybody's just playing champion, but we'll find out when we get there. So, yeah, that's the build. There's really not much to it. Spend a couple chaos, face tank the universe, have infinite recovery forever. There you go. Hold right mouse to win. GG. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the beach of 3.26.